The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hartwell Tower gleamed with polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Ashford. CEO Allison Hughes stood presenting quarterly projections when the conference room door burst open. A man in a delivery uniform rushed forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Security hadn't even processed the threat when Dylan Barrett, the evening janitor pushing the cleaning cart in the hallway, moved with blinding speed. Within seconds, the armed intruder lay face down, his weapon skidding across the marble floor. The second accomplice, who'd been posing as building maintenance, found himself immobilized against the wall before he could draw his gun. The entire boardroom froze in stunned silence as this quiet janitor, a single father whom everyone overlooked, stood between their CEO and certain death. Someone whispered the question that would change everything. Who is that man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hartwell Tower commanded a breathtaking view of downtown Ashford. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city's skyline as evening descended, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where 8 board members sat with tablets and leather portfolios. CEO Allison Hughes stood at the head of the table, her navy blazer perfectly tailored, her auburn hair pulled back in a professional twist. At 34, she was the youngest person to ever lead Meridian Tech Solutions, a position she'd earned through relentless innovation and a refusal to accept limitations others tried to impose on her. The quarterly presentation had been proceeding smoothly. Allison's confident voice filled the room as she outlined expansion strategies for their artificial intelligence division. Revenue projections glowed on the massive screen behind her, each chart representing months of strategic planning and calculated risks that were finally yielding results. The board members nodded approvingly, some taking notes, others leaning back in their ergonomic chairs with satisfied expressions. Nobody noticed when the conference room door opened slightly. The security desk downstairs had logged a late delivery, nothing unusual for a building that housed 36 companies working around the clock. The man wore a standard courier uniform, navy blue with a yellow logo patch, carrying a padded envelope that required an executive signature. He'd smiled at the lobby guard, shown credentials that looked legitimate, and been waved through to the elevator bank. But something was wrong with his eyes. Too focused. Too cold. His hand rested inside his jacket as he moved down the corridor, his stride purposeful rather than casual. He reached the boardroom door and pushed it open with sudden force. "Package for Ms. Hughes," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Allison looked up from her presentation, momentarily confused by the interruption. Several board members turned toward the door with expressions ranging from annoyance to curiosity. The courier's hand moved inside his jacket, fingers closing around cold metal dot in the hallway outside. Dylan Barrett had been methodically working his way through his evening cleaning routine. At 41 years old, he'd been the night janitor at Hartwell Tower for nearly 4 years. Most people barely noticed him as he emptied trash bins, vacuumed carpets, and wiped down surfaces after the building's daytime occupants went home. He wore the same gray uniform every shift, his cleaning cart a familiar sight rolling quietly through corridors after 6. Clock. Dylan had been refilling paper towels in the executive floor restroom when he'd spotted the courier. Something in the man's body language triggered an instinct Dylan had spent years trying to suppress. The way he moved, the tension in his shoulders, the position of his hand. Dylan had seen that stance before in places most Americans would never visit. In situations where split-second recognition meant the difference between life and death, he'd set down his supplies and followed at a distance, keeping his movements casual, just another janitor going about his work. When the courier burst into the boardroom, Dylan was close enough to hear the false cheerfulness in the man's voice, close enough to see the second figure emerge from a maintenance closet down the hall. The accomplice wore building maintenance coveralls, his hand also hidden inside his jacket. Dylan's mind processed the scenario in microseconds. Training from another lifetime, overriding his carefully constructed civilian persona. 2 armed individuals. Confined space. Multiple potential victims. Executive protection detail would be at least 90 seconds away. Far too long. He moved. The cleaning cart became a battering ram, slamming into the second attacker before the man could fully draw his weapon. Dylan's hands moved with practiced precision. One strike to disable the gun hand, another to the solar plexus that dropped the accomplice to his knees, gasping for air. The weapon clattered to the marble floor, and Dylan kicked it down the hallway in one fluid motion. Out in the boardroom, the first courier had drawn his pistol. Allison's eyes widened in recognition of imminent death. Board members froze, their brains struggling to process the impossibility of what was happening. This was Ashford, a peaceful city where violent crime was rare. This was Hartwell Tower, with its security protocols and badge scanners. This couldn't be real. Dylan crashed through the doorway before the courier could aim properly. His shoulder connected with the gunman's midsection, driving him backward into the conference table. The weapon discharged once, the shot going wild and shattering one of those expensive floor-to-ceiling windows. Safety glass spider-webbed, but held. The courier was trained, Dylan realized immediately. Not just some desperate criminal. The man recovered from the tackle faster than expected, bringing the gun back around with professional efficiency. But Dylan was faster. His hand chopped down on the courier's wrist with controlled force, exactly the right amount of pressure to the nerve cluster. The gun dropped. Dylan's other hand gripped the back of the man's head and slammed it face first into the mahogany table. Not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to end the fight. Within 15 seconds of entering the boardroom, both attackers were neutralized. The courier lay face down on the conference table, Dylan's knee pressed between his shoulder blades, one arm twisted at an angle that made resistance impossible. The accomplice in the hallway remained on the floor, still struggling to breathe properly, his weapon kicked far out of reach. The boardroom existed in suspended animation. 8 executives sat frozen in their chairs, unable to reconcile the violence they'd just witnessed with the mundane reality of their quarterly meeting. Allison stood at the head of the table, one hand pressed against her chest, her presentation remote still clutched in her other hand. The shattered window let in the sounds of the city below. Traffic and distant sirens suddenly audible in the climate-controlled silence they'd taken for granted. Dylan maintained his position, controlling the courier with minimal effort while his eyes scanned for additional threats. He'd learned long ago that attacks rarely came singly. Where there were 2 assailants, there might be 3. His breathing remained steady despite the burst of action, his heart rate already returning to normal. "Security is on the way," one of the board members finally managed to say, his voice shaking. He'd triggered the emergency alert on his phone with trembling fingers. "Keep everyone away from the hallway," Dylan said calmly, his tone carrying an authority that seemed to transform him. This wasn't the quiet janitor they passed without acknowledgement. This was someone else entirely. "The second one is still mobile." Heavy footsteps thundered in the corridor as Hartwell Tower's security team arrived, weapons drawn, radios crackling with urgent communications. They processed the scene with wide eyes, recognizing Dylan but unable to reconcile the man they knew with what had clearly just occurred. "Dylan?" The head of security, James Morrison, lowered his weapon slightly. "What the hell happened?" "2 armed individuals attempted to breach the boardroom," Dylan replied, his voice flat and professional. "Both secured. Check the one in the hallway for additional weapons. This one has a backup piece on his left ankle." Morrison's eyebrows rose. How could a janitor know about backup weapons and ankle holsters? But when they checked, sure enough, A small revolver was strapped exactly where Dylan had indicated. Allison finally found her voice. "He saved our lives." She looked at Dylan as if seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. "You saved our lives." Dylan met her gaze briefly before looking away. "Just happened to be in the right place." His voice had already shifted back to something more neutral, less commanding. The man who'd moved with deadly efficiency was retreating behind the familiar mask of the unremarkable janitor. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Morrison took control of the two attackers while his team secured the floor. Dylan stepped back, suddenly aware that a dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on him, with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to something approaching awe. "Who are you?" One of the board members voiced the question they were all thinking. "Really? Really?" Dylan didn't answer. He simply retrieved his cleaning cart from the hallway, his hands steady as he righted the supplies that had spilled during the confrontation. The police would want statements. There would be questions. His carefully maintained anonymity was shattered. But as he glanced back at Allison, still standing at the head of that boardroom table, still alive because of choices he'd made in a handful of seconds, Dylan couldn't bring himself to regret the exposure. Some things were worth revealing yourself for. Dylan Barrett lived in a world of deliberate invisibility. He clocked in at Hartwell Tower every evening at 6, retrieved his cleaning cart from the supply room on the basement level, and systematically worked his way through 12 floors of offices, conference rooms, and executive suites. His gray uniform had his first name embroidered over the pocket. Most people never looked closely enough to read it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That anonymity was exactly what Dylan wanted. At 41, he'd constructed a life of careful routine and managed expectations. The janitorial position paid $32,000 annually, enough to cover rent on their 2-bedroom apartment in Glendale Heights, put food on the table, and maintain the used Honda Civic that had 200,000 miles but still ran reliably. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted for him 15 years ago. But it was stable, and stability mattered more than prestige when you were responsible for raising a 7-year-old daughter. Alone, Dylan's build still carried the evidence of a different life. His shoulders remained broad despite years away from intensive training regimens. His forearms showed the kind of functional muscle that came from real work rather than gym memberships. He kept his dark brown hair cut short, more out of habit than military requirement now, though old patterns died hard. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Most people didn't look, before Hartwell Tower, before Ashford. Before he became a man who pushed a cleaning cart through corporate hallways. Dylan had been Sergeant First Class Dylan Barrett of the 75th Ranger Regiment. For 12 years, he'd served in some of the most demanding military operations conducted by American forces. His file, still classified in a database he no longer had access to, contained commendations for valor, strategic thinking under pressure, and an almost supernatural ability to assess and neutralize threats in complex environments. He'd led teams through hostile territory where mistakes weren't measured in poor performance reviews but in body bags. He'd made decisions that saved lives and haunted him with equal measure. He'd been exceptional at something most humans would never be asked to do, and for years, that exceptionalism had defined his identity. But exceptional soldiers made poor fathers when their daughters needed them home. Needed consistency and safety rather than a parent who deployed to classified locations with uncertain return dates. Dylan had learned that the hard way. The people at Hartwell Tower knew almost nothing about his past. His job application had listed military service in the employment history section, but that covered everything from supply clerks to special operations forces. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Dylan Barrett, the janitor, was polite, punctual, and thorough in his work. He kept to himself during breaks, eating lunch from a packed cooler rather than joining other building staff in the basement cafeteria. He never volunteered personal information. His supervisor, Frank Chun, a 62-year-old maintenance coordinator who'd worked at Hartwell Tower for 30 years, appreciated employees who showed up on time and didn't create drama. Barrett's solid, Frank would tell anyone who asked. Does his work, doesn't complain, never calls in sick. Best kind of employee. What Frank didn't know was that Dylan had been awake since 4:30 that morning, the same time he woke every day regardless of his work schedule. Old habits. He'd gone for a 5-mile run through Glendale Heights while most of the neighborhood still slept, his pace steady and controlled. Not training for anything specific anymore. Just maintaining the baseline fitness that felt wrong to abandon. He'd returned home to find his daughter, 7-year-old Emma, already awake and attempting to make breakfast. Dylan had gently taken over waffle preparation while Emma chattered about her upcoming science project on ecosystems. She wanted to build a terrarium. Did they have enough money for the supplies? Dylan had assured her they did, mentally calculating which bills could be juggled to afford glass containers and potting soil. He'd walked Emma to Riverside Elementary, 6 blocks from their apartment, her small hand in his larger one, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she skipped along the sidewalk. Other parents drove their offspring to school in SUVs and minivans. Dylan walked, partly because it saved gas money, partly because these 20 minutes each morning, just him and Emma discussing whatever captured her curious mind, felt like the most important part of his day. At the school entrance, Emma had hugged him tightly before running off to join her friends. Dylan had watched until she disappeared inside, that familiar knot of protective concern tightening in his chest. Emma was his entire world, the reason he'd walked away from the military, the reason he accepted a job that used maybe 1% of his actual capabilities. After dropping Emma off, Dylan had returned to their apartment and slept for a few hours. Night shift work required adjustment. He'd learned to sleep in segments, to function on less rest than most people considered adequate. Another skill from his previous life that translated unexpectedly well to single parenthood and third-shift employment. He'd woken at 2 in the afternoon, picked Emma up from school at 3, and spent the afternoon helping with homework and playing board games until Mrs. Patel from the apartment next door arrived at 5:30. Mrs. Patel, a retired teacher in her 70s, watched Emma most evenings when Dylan worked. She charged $20 per night, below market rate, because she genuinely enjoyed Emma's company, and Dylan always helped her carry groceries and fixed things around her apartment. Without being asked. This was Dylan's life. Now, structured, predictable, safe, he'd traded adrenaline and purpose for stability and presence. Most days he believed it was the right choice. Some nights, lying awake at 3 in the morning between his shift and dawn, he wondered if he'd given up too much of himself. If Emma would someday realize her father had been capable of extraordinary things, but chose to live an ordinary life. His co-workers at Hartwell Tower saw none of this complexity. They saw Dylan the janitor, unremarkable and forgettable. That was exactly what he'd spent 4 years cultivating. Invisibility was its own kind of protection. If nobody noticed you, nobody asked questions. Nobody dug into your past. Nobody expected more than you were willing to give. The evening of the boardroom incident, Dylan had arrived at work the same as always. He'd nodded to Martin at the security desk, scanned his badge, and taken the service elevator to the basement supply room. He'd loaded his cart with trash bags, cleaning solutions, microfiber cloths, and vacuum attachments. Floor by floor, office by office, he'd worked through his routine with practiced efficiency. The executive floors were always his last stop, after 7 o'clock when most high-level employees had gone home. Dylan actually preferred the 42nd floor. The offices were cleaner to begin with, less traffic meant less mess. And the floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Ashford that reminded him the world was bigger than cleaning supplies and trash bins. He'd noticed the courier in the elevator bank around 7:30. Something about the man's demeanor triggered instincts Dylan had tried to suppress. The hypervigilance that made you an asset in combat zones made you paranoid in civilian life. He'd forced himself to ignore it initially. This was Ashford. This was a secure building. The probability of actual threat was minimal, but the instincts wouldn't quiet. Dylan had learned long ago that intuition refined by experience wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition functioning faster than conscious thought. He'd followed the courier at a distance, telling himself he was being ridiculous even as his body moved into a threat assessment posture. Then the maintenance closet door had opened. The second figure had emerged, and Dylan's training had taken over, bypassing conscious decision-making in favor of immediate action. Now, hours after the incident, after the police interviews and the security debriefings and the shocked expressions of people who'd never really looked at him before, Dylan sat in the building's security office waiting for final clearance to leave. His hands were steady as he filled out yet another statement form. His expression remained neutral despite the chaos his intervention had created. James Morrison, head of security, leaned against the desk watching Dylan with undisguised curiosity. The police ran your background. Found your military record. Rangers, huh? Why the hell are you working as a janitor with that kind of training? Dylan didn't look up from the form. Needed a job with regular hours. This one fit. You saved the CEO's life tonight. Probably saved 8 other people too. You know what that means? It means I was in the right place at the right time. It means I was in the right place at the right time. Morrison shook his head slowly. It means you're not going to be invisible anymore, Barrett. Word's already spreading. By tomorrow, everyone in this building is going to know what you did. Dylan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. That was exactly what he'd feared. The anonymity he'd carefully built was shattered. Emma's father wouldn't be just another person anymore. He'd be the guy who took down armed attackers. There would be questions, attention, complications. I just want to finish my shift and go home, Dylan said quietly. Your shift is over, Morrison replied. Allison Hughes wants to see you tomorrow. 10 o'clock, her office. She was pretty insistent. Dylan finally looked up. I don't need thanks. I don't need recognition. I just need to keep my job. Your job is safe, Morrison assured him. But something tells me things are about to change for you, whether you want them to or not. Dylan left Hartwell Tower at midnight, 3 hours past his usual departure time. The city streets were quiet as he drove home, his mind already working through how to explain the evening to Emma without frightening her. She was resilient, his daughter, but she worried about him in ways 7-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about their parents. Their apartment was dark when he Mrs. Patel had left a note saying Emma had gone to bed at 8:30 after finishing her homework. Dylan checked on his daughter, standing in her doorway and watching her sleep in the glow of the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. Her stuffed elephant was clutched under one arm. Her hair spread across the pillow in dark waves. This was what mattered. Not recognition or gratitude or people finally seeing him as something more than a janitor. Just this small person who depended on him completely, who loved him unconditionally, who deserved a father present and whole rather than trapped in a past he couldn't change. Dylan pulled Emma's door mostly closed and retreated to the living room. He sat in the worn armchair by the window, looking out at Glendale Heights' modest skyline, and wondered how much his carefully ordered life was about to unravel. Dylan had never planned to become a single father. That particular future had arrived suddenly, violently. In a hospital emergency room on a Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago, When everything he'd taken for granted shattered beyond repair, her name had been Sarah Catherine Barrett. With her infectious laugh and ridiculous optimism that somehow balanced his more pragmatic worldview. They'd met during one of his rare stateside periods, at a coffee shop near Fort Benning, where she'd been working on her graduate thesis in education. Dylan had been in dress uniform, just finished with a pre-deployment briefing. His mind already shifting to the mission ahead. Sarah had looked up from her laptop as he'd waited for his order, caught his eye, and smiled. Not the uncertain smile women sometimes gave men in uniform, unsure whether to acknowledge them or not. This had been genuine, warm, the kind of smile that suggested she saw past the uniform to the person wearing it. Long day? She'd asked, nodding at his coffee order, black with an extra shot of espresso. Long year ahead, he'd replied without thinking. That had been the beginning. Dylan still marveled sometimes at how completely a life could change in the space of a coffee shop conversation. They'd talked for 40 minutes, long enough that Dylan had been late returning to base, something that had never happened to him before. Sarah had a quality that made you want to be honest, to skip past small talk and discuss things that actually mattered. They dated during his brief windows of availability, maintained contact during deployments through sporadic emails and rare phone calls when communication was possible. It shouldn't have worked. Military relationships, especially special operations relationships, had failure built into their foundation. But Sarah had been different, patient, understanding without being passive, clear about her needs without making unreasonable demands. "I know what I'm signing up for," she'd told him when he'd tried to give her an out before things got serious. "I see you, Dylan, the real you. And I want this." They'd married during a 2-week leave period, small ceremony, just immediate family and a handful of close friends. Emma had arrived 11 months later, 8 pounds of squalling perfection that had terrified Dylan more than any combat situation he'd faced. He'd held his daughter in the hospital, this impossibly tiny human, and felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of risk and consequence. For 2 years, they'd made it work. Sarah had been extraordinary, managing their household during his absences, maintaining normalcy for Emma, greeting him at the door whenever he returned with that same genuine smile that had caught his attention in a coffee shop. She'd never complained about the difficulties, never asked him to choose between his family and his service. She'd simply loved him and created a home worth returning to. Dylan's last deployment had been to East Africa, a 6-month rotation conducting training operations and counter-terrorism initiatives. Emma had been 2 years old when he'd left, just beginning to form sentences and ask endless questions about everything. He'd video called when possible, watching his daughter grow through a screen, hearing Sarah's voice telling him about Emma's first successful use of the potty, her new words, her personality emerging. He'd returned to Fort Benning on a Thursday in September, exhausted but relieved to be stateside. The reunion at the airport had been perfect. Emma had run to him on unsteady toddler legs, shouting, "Daddy!" with pure joy. Sarah had wrapped her arms around both of them, and for those moments, everything had been exactly right. They'd gone home to their base housing, a modest 2-bedroom that Sarah had somehow made feel spacious and welcoming. Dylan had spent the weekend reconnecting, playing with Emma, holding Sarah, slowly transitioning from deployment mode back to domestic life. It was always jarring, that shift from hypervigilance to normalcy, but Sarah made it easier. On Tuesday afternoon, Sarah had developed a severe headache. Nothing unusual initially. She'd been prone to migraines, usually managed them with over-the-counter medication and rest. But this one had been different, intense, accompanied by confusion and difficulty speaking. Dylan had recognized something was seriously wrong within minutes. He'd called 911, gotten them to the emergency room while Mrs. Harrison from next door stayed with Emma. The A doctors had done scans, called specialists, moved with increasing urgency that Dylan's combat experience Recognized as a bad sign. Cerebral aneurysm. Ruptured. Sarah's brain had been hemorrhaging while they'd stood in those sterile hallways. The neurosurgeon had explained the situation with clinical precision. Emergency surgery. Low probability of positive outcome. Even if she survived, catastrophic brain damage was likely. Dylan had authorized the surgery, because what else could he do? Then he'd sat in a waiting room with fluorescent lights and year-old magazines, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies the way he'd been trained. Except there was no tactical solution to this problem. No way to outmaneuver death. No backup plan that brought Sarah home. She died on the operating table at 11:47 p.m., 48 hours after Dylan's return. The neurosurgeon had delivered the news with professional sympathy, explained that sometimes these aneurysms were congenital, undetectable, that nothing could have prevented it. Dylan had nodded and thanked him and felt his entire world collapse inward. Emma had been 2 years old, too young to understand death, young enough that her memories of her mother would eventually fade to fragments and photographs. Dylan had been 36 years old, trained to handle extreme situations, completely unprepared for explaining to his daughter why mommy wasn't coming home. The grief had been overwhelming, but there hadn't been time to process it properly. Emma had needed him. Immediate, constant need that didn't pause for mourning. Dylan had taken emergency leave, handled funeral arrangements, dealt with paperwork and decisions and the horrible logistics of death. Through it all, Emma had clung to him, confused and frightened by the sudden absence of the person who'd been her primary caregiver. 3 weeks after Sarah's death, Dylan had submitted his resignation from the military. His commanding officer had tried to talk him out of it, offered extended leave, suggested alternatives. But Dylan's decision had been absolute. Emma needed stability. She needed a parent who was present, not deployed to classified locations for months at a time. She needed someone to wake up to every single morning, not a father who appeared and disappeared according to operational demands. Some of his teammates had understood. Others had been disappointed, felt like he was abandoning the mission, the brotherhood. Dylan hadn't tried to explain. They would understand when they had offspring of their own, or they wouldn't. Either way, his choice had been made. He'd relocated to Ashford because it was far from Fort Benning, far from the places that reminded him constantly of Sarah. He'd needed a fresh start. Somewhere Emma could grow up without being the kid whose mom died, the daughter of the ranger who'd left the service. Ashford had been random, a mid-sized city in the Midwest with reasonable cost of living and good schools. As good a place as any to rebuild. As good a place as any to rebuild. The janitorial position at Hartwell Tower had been the first job offer he'd received. Dylan had been overqualified to an almost comical degree, but he'd needed income immediately, and the night shift worked around Emma's school schedule. He'd accepted, telling himself it was temporary, something to keep them afloat while he figured out a better plan. 4 years later, he was still pushing that cleaning cart. The temporary solution had become permanent, because changing required energy Dylan didn't have. His life had narrowed to manageable routines. Wake up, run, care for Emma, work, sleep, repeat. Anything beyond that felt dangerous. Like opening doors he'd carefully sealed. Emma had adapted better than Dylan had expected. At 7 years old, she was bright, curious, mostly happy. She asked about her mother sometimes, looking at photographs, wanting stories. Dylan told her carefully edited versions of their life together, emphasizing Sarah's love, her warmth, the joy she'd taken in being Emma's mom. He never mentioned the deployment schedule that had stolen so much time. Never discussed the constant background stress of waiting for the next mission. Never acknowledged his own guilt that he'd been gone so often during the brief time they'd had together. Therapy had helped, both for him and Emma. Dylan had never been one for talking about feelings, but he'd forced himself to sit in those sessions because Emma deserved a parent who processed trauma rather than burying it. The therapist had explained that grief wasn't linear, that healing happened in irregular patterns, that some losses you learn to carry rather than overcome. Dylan carried Sarah's absence every day. In the morning routine he'd had to figure out alone. In the braiding of Emma's hair that he'd taught himself through YouTube videos, because Sarah had always done it, and Emma loved having her hair braided. In the empty pillow beside him every night. In the future he'd imagined that would never happen now. The hardest part wasn't the grief itself, though that remained sharp even years later. The hardest part was the isolation. Dylan had become intensely private after Sarah's death, unable to form new connections when the last one had ended so catastrophically. He went to work, came home, focused on Emma. That was enough. That had to be enough. Opening himself to caring about anyone else felt like volunteering for more loss. More pain. Mrs. Patel was the closest thing Dylan had to a friend. And that relationship existed primarily because Emma needed childcare. The parents at Emma's school tried to include him in social events sometimes. Single dad might be looking to date, they probably thought. Dylan always declined politely. He attended Emma's school functions, volunteered for field trips, showed up for parent-teacher conferences. But he kept distance between himself and the other adults, maintaining the walls that kept his world manageable. Those walls had worked until the boardroom incident. Dylan had intervened because his training wouldn't allow him to stand by while people died. But he'd known immediately that his action would have consequences beyond the immediate situation. Visibility meant vulnerability. People would want to know more about him, would ask questions, would chip away at the carefully maintained boundaries, sitting in his apartment after midnight, watching Glendale Heights through the window. Dylan felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Allison Hughes wanted to see him, the woman whose life he'd saved. The CEO who probably felt obligated to express gratitude, offer recognition, maybe even a promotion or reward. Dylan didn't want any of it. He wanted to return to invisibility, to the routine that kept him and Emma safe from complication. But he'd learned in combat that you couldn't unfire a weapon, couldn't take back actions once committed. He'd revealed himself, and now he'd have to deal with whatever came next. He checked on Emma one more time before attempting sleep. She remained peaceful, undisturbed, innocent of the ways her father's world was shifting. Dylan stood in her doorway for a long moment, drawing strength from her presence the way he'd done countless times over the past 5 years. Tomorrow, he would face whatever Allison Hughes wanted. Tomorrow he would deal with questions and attention and the fracturing of his carefully ordered life. But tonight, Emma was safe, asleep in her room, and that was enough. That had to be enough. Some wounds never fully healed. You just learned to function around them, to build a life in the spaces that remained. Dylan had become expert at that particular skill. He would adapt to this new situation the way he'd adapted to everything else. For Emma's sake. Always for Emma. Allison Hughes had never expected to become CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions by 34. The position had arrived through a combination of strategic brilliance, relentless work ethic, and circumstances that forced the board to acknowledge what they'd been reluctant to admit. She was the best person for the job, regardless of her age or gender, growing up in suburban Detroit. Allison had been the daughter of a high school math teacher and an emergency room nurse. Money had been tight but never desperate, her parents instilling values of education and self-reliance that shaped everything that followed. Her mother, Patricia, had worked overnight shifts at Detroit General, coming home exhausted but always making time to help with homework. Her father, Robert, had taught algebra to generations of teenagers while running a small tutoring service from their basement on weekends. Allison had inherited her mother's sharp analytical mind and her father's ability to explain complex concepts in accessible ways. She'd excelled in school without trying particularly hard, the kind of student teachers remembered years later. Mathematics came naturally. Computer science felt like discovering a language she'd always been meant to speak. By 16, she was taking college-level courses. By 18, she'd received full scholarship offers from 7 universities. She'd chosen MIT. Drawn by its reputation and the opportunity to work with professors pushing the boundaries of artificial intelligence research. Boston had felt overwhelming initially, the pace and competition far more intense than anything she'd experienced in Detroit. But Allison had adapted quickly, discovering that her combination of technical skill and communication ability gave her advantages over peers who excelled at only one or the other. During her junior year, she'd met Nathan Pierce at a campus entrepreneurship event. Nathan had been a graduate student in the business school, charismatic and ambitious, already talking about disrupting industries and building the next major tech company. He'd approached Allison after her presentation on machine learning applications. Impressed by her ideas and her confidence in presenting them, their relationship had developed quickly, fueled by shared ambition and complementary skills. Nathan understood markets and capital. Allison understood technology and innovation. Together, they'd seemed unstoppable. They'd gotten engaged 3 months after Allison's graduation, planning a future that included both marriage and a startup company that would revolutionize how businesses used artificial intelligence. Meridian Tech Solutions had launched in a small office space in Cambridge with 5 employees and funding from angel investors Nathan had courted. Allison had served as Chief Technology Officer, building the products while Nathan handled business development and investor relations. For the first 2 years, the company had grown steadily, signing clients, expanding staff, attracting attention from venture capital firms. Allison had poured everything into Meridian. 18-hour days were normal. Weekends disappeared into code reviews and product development. Her entire identity became wrapped up in the company's success. Nathan had matched her intensity, constantly pushing for more growth, more funding, more market share. They'd set a wedding date twice and postponed both times because of business demands. The problems had started subtly. Nathan making decisions without consulting her. Client meetings where Allison's technical expertise was presented as Nathan's vision. Board presentations where her contributions were minimized or attributed to the team, generally rather than her specifically. When she'd raised concerns, Nathan had dismissed them as misunderstandings, assured her they were partners, insisted he valued her contributions equally, but the pattern had continued and intensified. Investors who'd initially been excited about Allison's technical leadership began directing all their communication through Nathan. Media coverage positioned him as the visionary founder, mentioning Allison primarily as his fiancée who also happened to work at the company. When venture capital firms came calling with serious funding offers, Nathan had negotiated the terms without her input, accepting a deal that gave him majority control and positioned him as sole CEO. Allison had been 26 years old when she'd finally confronted Nathan about the systematic erasure of her role. The conversation had been devastating. Nathan had been honest in a way that felt cruel. He'd never seen her as an equal partner. He'd valued her technical skills, yes, but leadership required different qualities. Investors wanted a certain type of CEO, and she wasn't it. He'd actually said that. She wasn't it. She wasn't it. The engagement had ended that night. Allison had considered leaving Meridian entirely, starting over somewhere that would value her contributions. But she'd built this company as much as Nathan had. Every line of code in their core products had come from her or engineers she'd trained. The technology that made Meridian valuable was her creation. Walking away felt like letting Nathan steal something that belonged to her. Instead, she'd stayed and fought. She'd documented every contribution, every product decision, every client relationship that existed because of her work. She'd reached out to board members individually, rebuilding relationships Nathan had tried to monopolize. She'd made herself indispensable, so critical to operations that removing her would damage the company significantly. For 3 years, Allison had existed in an uncomfortable equilibrium. Nathan remained CEO. She remained CTO. They maintained professional courtesy in meetings while barely speaking otherwise. The company continued growing, going public when Allison was 29, making both of them wealthy on paper, even as their personal relationship remained toxic. The crisis had come suddenly. Nathan had made a series of poor strategic decisions, chasing trends rather than focusing on Meridian's core strengths. He'd committed to product timelines the engineering team couldn't meet, overpromised capabilities to major clients, and alienated key employees with his increasingly erratic management style. When a critical product launch failed spectacularly, costing the company 3 major contracts and millions in revenue, the board had finally acted. Nathan had been removed as CEO. The decision had been unanimous, something he'd apparently never anticipated. He'd owned the largest individual share of company stock, but not enough to override a united board. They'd offered him a position as advisor with limited authority. He'd refused and sold his shares instead, leaving Meridian entirely rather than accept diminished status. The board had approached Allison that same week. They wanted her as CEO, interim initially, with the understanding that if she performed well, the position would become permanent. Allison had been 31 years old, younger than any CEO of a publicly traded tech company in recent history. The appointment had generated significant media attention, much of it skeptical about whether she could handle the role. She'd proven herself within 6 months. Allison had stabilized operations, repaired client relationships, and refocused the company on sustainable innovation rather than flashy announcements. She'd promoted from within, building a leadership team that valued collaboration over ego. Revenue had returned to growth. Stock prices had recovered. By 32, her interim status had been removed. By 33, Meridian had expanded into international markets and doubled its workforce. Now 34, Allison led a company valued at over $3 billion. She employed 4,000 people across 12 offices worldwide. Industry publications featured her regularly, discussing her leadership style, her approach to artificial intelligence ethics, her success as a young female CEO in a male-dominated field. She'd given keynote speeches, appeared on panel discussions, been recognized with awards she'd never imagined receiving. But success had come with costs. Allison's personal life had essentially ceased to exist. She worked constantly, driven by a combination of ambition and lingering insecurity that whispered she had to keep proving herself. Relationships had been impossible. The few times she'd tried dating, the men had been either intimidated by her position or attracted primarily to her status and wealth. She'd learned to recognize both types quickly and had stopped trying. Her penthouse apartment in downtown Ashford remained mostly empty. Expensive furniture purchased by an interior designer sat in rooms Allison barely used. She typically woke at 5, went to the gym in her building, arrived at the office by 7, and worked until 8 or 9 at night. Weekends looked similar. She'd become the person Nathan had accused her of not being. The driven CEO who prioritized company success above everything else. Loneliness had become a constant companion. Allison maintained professional relationships, but few personal ones. Her parents still lived in Detroit, and she called them weekly, but visited rarely. Her college friends had drifted away, unable to relate to her lifestyle. Board members respected her, but kept appropriate distance. Employees admired her but saw her as the boss, not a person they could be casual with. The isolation had intensified after an incident 6 months ago. Allison had been walking to her car in the Hartwell Tower parking garage late one evening when she'd been approached by someone she'd thought was just another employee. He'd commented on her working late, seemed friendly initially, but his demeanor had shifted suddenly, becoming aggressive, demanding. He'd backed her against her vehicle while making threats about what would happen if she reported recent harassment complaints from his department. Building security had intervened before the situation escalated, and the employee had been terminated immediately. But the encounter had shaken Allison more than she'd admitted. She'd started paying for a car service rather than driving herself. She'd become hyper-aware of her surroundings, of being alone in isolated spaces. The confidence she projected in boardrooms felt thinner, more performed than genuine. She'd considered hiring personal security, but resisted the idea. That felt like admitting vulnerability, allowing fear to dictate her choices. Allison Hughes had built her career on refusing to be limited by others' expectations. Hiring bodyguards felt like accepting that being a woman in her position meant accepting restrictions men wouldn't face. Then the boardroom incident had happened. 2 armed men had breached what should have been secure space. Allison had looked at that gun and known with absolute certainty that she was about to die. Her last thought had been how pointless it all seemed. All the work and success and achievement, ending in violence she couldn't prevent or control. Dylan Barrett had appeared like something from an action movie, moving with speed and precision that seemed impossible. He'd put himself between her and death without hesitation, neutralized threats that had professional training backing them. Allison had watched the entire sequence in stunned disbelief, unable to process how her quiet night janitor had become someone entirely different after the police and security teams had finished their work. After board members had been sent home and statements had been taken, Allison had gone to her office and locked the door. She'd sat in her chair, staring at the Ashford skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and finally allowed herself to shake. The adrenaline crash had been intense, her hands trembling, her breathing unsteady. She'd nearly died. That reality kept repeating in her mind. Without Dylan's intervention, she would have died. Her parents would have gotten a phone call. Meridian would have released a statement. There would have been a memorial service and tributes, and everything would have continued without her. All her work, all her success, all her careful construction of a life that proved she was capable and strong and worthy. It could have ended in 15 seconds of violence. Dylan had saved her life. This man she'd passed countless times in hallways, never really looking at him, certainly never imagining he possessed the skills and courage to do what he'd done. Allison felt intense gratitude mixed with curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. She wanted to understand him, to know his story, to comprehend how someone with his capabilities ended up pushing a cleaning cart. She'd instructed James Morrison to arrange a meeting. 10 o'clock the next morning, her office. Allison wanted to thank Dylan properly, away from the chaos and witnesses. She also wanted to offer him something, though she wasn't entirely sure what. A better position, certainly. Financial compensation for saving 8 lives, including hers. But those felt inadequate somehow. Transactional responses to something that defied transaction. That night, in her mostly empty penthouse, Allison had stood at her own floor-to-ceiling windows looking at the same city Dylan could see from his modest apartment. She'd thought about the contrast between them. Her wealth and success built on years of fighting for recognition. His anonymity chosen deliberately, despite capabilities that clearly exceeded his current role. Her isolation born from ambition. His from grief and protection of someone he loved. For the first time in years, Allison had wondered if success meant what she'd convinced herself it meant. If the life she'd built was actually the life she wanted. If proving herself constantly was the same as being fulfilled. Dylan Barrett had saved her life. But standing there in the darkness, looking at her reflection in glass that cost more than most people's annual salary, Allison wondered if maybe he'd also shown her something she'd been missing. Connection. Authenticity. Life built around what mattered rather than what. Impressed, she didn't know what she would say to him tomorrow. Thank you felt insufficient. But it was a beginning, and Allison had always been good at beginnings. She'd built a company from one. Maybe she could build something else too, though she couldn't quite define what that something was yet. The city lights glittered below, indifferent to human drama, constant and distant. Allison Hughes, CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions, stood alone in her expensive apartment and thought about a janitor who'd refused to let her die. Tomorrow they would talk. Tomorrow something would begin. Though neither of them could predict exactly what Ashford existed as the kind of mid-sized American city that didn't demand attention, but provided comfortable anonymity for those seeking it. With a population hovering around 300,000, it was large enough to offer urban amenities, but small enough that rush hour lasted 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. Located in the southern part of Michigan, Ashford had grown originally around automotive manufacturing but had successfully diversified over the past 2 decades into technology, healthcare, and education sectors. Downtown Ashford featured the typical collection of glass and steel office towers that defined modern American business districts. Hartwell Tower stood among them, 36 floors of premium office space housing various companies ranging from law firms to tech startups. Built in 2008, just before the financial crisis had temporarily halted construction projects nationwide, Hartwell represented the optimistic assumption that Ashford's economy would continue expanding indefinitely. The tower's exterior featured reflective blue-tinted glass that caught sunrise and sunset dramatically, making it a favorite subject for local photographers. Its ground floor included a coffee shop, a sandwich place, and a small convenience store catering to building occupants. The lobby featured marble floors, modern art installations that changed quarterly, and a security desk staffed 24 hours daily. 3 elevator banks served different floor ranges, their stainless steel doors gleaming under recessed lighting. Meridian Tech Solutions occupied floors 39 through 42, having expanded over the years from the single floor they'd initially leased. The 42nd floor held executive offices and the main boardroom where recent events had unfolded. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views that extended for miles on clear days, showing Ashford's downtown core transitioning to residential neighborhoods and eventually to the agricultural land that surrounded the city. The surrounding downtown area maintained the balance between professional and accessible that characterized Ashford generally. Within 3 blocks of Hartwell Tower, you could find upscale restaurants serving expense account lunches, alongside family-owned diners that had operated for generations. Coffee shops ranged from national chains to independent establishments. A farmer's market occupied the main square every Saturday from May through October, vendors selling produce, baked goods, and handcrafted items to downtown residents and suburban visitors. Glendale Heights, where Dylan and Emma lived, sat approximately 4 miles from downtown. The neighborhood had been built primarily in the 1960s and 70s. Modest single-family homes and low-rise apartment complexes intended for working-class families. Some areas had gentrified over recent years, young professionals attracted by affordable housing and reasonable commutes. Other sections retained their original character. Long-time residents, maintaining properties through economic ups and downs. Dylan's apartment building was a 3-story brick structure, built in 1972. 12 units total. Mix of 1 and 2 bedrooms. Shared laundry in the basement, parking lot in back. The building showed its age but remained well maintained, thanks to a landlord who actually fixed things when they broke. Rent was $800 monthly for Dylan's 2-bedroom, far below market rate for comparable space closer to downtown. The neighborhood itself maintained a comfortable diversity. Families, retirees, young couples, single parents like Dylan. Mrs. Patel had lived in the building for 15 years. The family downstairs had 3 teenagers who practiced garage band, music at volumes that occasionally required polite requests to turn it down. Across the parking lot, A young couple with twin toddlers struggled with the chaos that came with raising two humans simultaneously. Riverside Elementary, where Emma attended second grade, occupied a brick building constructed in 1955, with additions added as enrollment grew. The school served approximately 400 students from kindergarten through fifth grade, drawing from Glendale Heights and surrounding neighborhoods. Its playground featured modern equipment installed 3 years ago after a successful fundraising campaign. The principal, Dr. Ellen Morrison, had been with the district for 20 years and ran the school with a combination of high standards and genuine care for students. Emma's teacher, Miss Carolyn Webster, was 26 years old and in her third year of teaching. She'd grown up in Ashford, left for college, and returned deliberately because she wanted to teach in her hometown. Dylan appreciated her communication style, her regular updates about Emma's progress, her understanding when he had to miss daytime events because of his work schedule. The community surrounding Riverside Elementary reflected Ashford's character generally. Parent volunteers organized events, but without the competitive intensity that characterized wealthier districts. The PTA raised money for classroom supplies and field trips, but didn't have the resources for elaborate programs. Kids walked to school if they lived close enough, were dropped off by working parents rushing to jobs, or rode buses that covered routes extending several miles throughout Ashford. You could find the standard elements of American mid-sized city life. Shopping centers with big box stores anchoring smaller retailers. Medical facilities ranging from urgent care clinics to Ashford General Hospital, a full-service facility employing 3,000 people. Parks maintained by the City Recreation Department, some elaborate with sports fields and playgrounds, others simple green spaces with benches and walking paths. The cultural scene existed but modestly. Ashford Community Theater produced shows in a converted warehouse space. The symphony orchestra performed at the Civic Center downtown. Season subscriptions affordable enough that middle-class families could attend. A small art museum featured rotating exhibitions and permanent collections focusing on regional artists. The public library system operated a main branch downtown and 5 smaller locations in various neighborhoods, providing services that remained essential despite the internet age. Food options reflected Ashford's demographics. Chain restaurants dominated the commercial strips along major roads, familiar logos promising consistent mediocrity. But interspersed among them were local establishments that had earned loyal followings. Sal's Pizza had operated on Westfield Avenue for 40 years. The Golden Lotus served authentic Chinese food. Run by the Chun family who'd immigrated in 1989, Morrison's Steakhouse occupied a converted bank building. Its bar featuring craft beers from Michigan breweries. Weather in Ashford followed typical Great Lakes patterns. Winters brought significant snow, temperatures regularly dropping below freezing from December through February. Spring arrived gradually, alternating between warm promise and late-season cold snaps. Summers offered genuine heat and humidity, residents complaining about the weather while simultaneously enjoying it. Fall delivered spectacular color as trees transformed. October weekends drawing people to parks and trails. The economic situation in Ashford mirrored many similar cities. Corporate headquarters and tech companies provided good-paying professional jobs. Healthcare and education employed significant portions of the workforce. Manufacturing still existed, but diminished from its peak decades earlier. Service industry jobs filled gaps, paying less but offering flexible schedules that worked for students and parents. Income inequality existed but less dramatically than in larger cities. Wealthy neighborhoods featured houses valued above $500,000. Poor areas struggled with the challenges of concentrated poverty. But most residents fell somewhere in the middle, working jobs that paid bills without providing luxury, living in homes they could afford without excess disposable income. Hartwell Tower existed at the intersection of these realities. The companies occupying its floors represented Ashford's economic aspiration, the professional jobs that provided stability and growth opportunity. But the building's functioning depended on people like Delanne, working night shifts for modest wages, keeping spaces clean and functional so professionals could focus on higher value work. This was the world where Dylan had built his quiet life, where Allison had established her company and her reputation, where Emma attended school and made friends and grew up without understanding yet how different her father was from what he appeared, where ordinary routine could be shattered by violence in seconds, revealing that safety was always more fragile than people wanted to believe. Ashford wasn't special. Thousands of American cities shared its characteristics, but it was home to 300,000 people living their lives with the same hopes and struggles humans experienced everywhere. Some built empires, some raised families, some simply survived. The city provided the stage, indifferent to individual dramas, constant and familiar. Constant and familiar. Within this ordinary setting, extraordinary events had intersected two lives that otherwise would never have truly connected. CEO and janitor. Wealth and modest means. Ambition and contentment. Allison and Delanne had existed in the same physical space for years without really seeing each other. Separated by assumptions about who mattered and who didn't, but assumptions could be shattered as easily as boardroom windows. In the aftermath of violence, both would discover that the person they'd overlooked possessed depth they'd never imagined. The city would continue its rhythm regardless. Ashford didn't pause for individual revelations. But for Allison and Dylan, the familiar landscape was about to transform into something entirely different. The foundation had been set. The stage was prepared. Now the real story could begin. Morning arrived at Hartwell Tower with unusual energy. Word of the previous evening's incident had spread through building occupants with the speed that significant events always generated. By 8 o'clock, when the first wave of employees arrived for work, speculation and rumor had already transformed the basic facts into various, dramatic versions. Dylan had saved the CEO. No, Dylan had taken down 3 armed men. Actually, there had been 5 attackers. Someone said Dylan was former Special Forces. Another person insisted he'd been Secret Service. The security footage was apparently incredible, though nobody had actually seen it except building security and police investigators. Martin, working the morning shift at the security desk, fielded questions from dozens of people wanting to know what had really happened. He'd been off duty during the incident, but had watched the footage when he'd arrived early that morning. "I've worked security for 15 years, he told anyone who asked. Never seen anything like what Barrack did. Professional doesn't even cover it. By 9:30, when Allison arrived at her office, her assistant Rebecca had already fielded calls from board members, media outlets requesting comment, and security consultants offering their services. Rebecca, a competent 45-year-old woman who'd been with Meridian for 6 years, greeted Allison with unusual urgency. "The media got hold of the story," Rebecca reported. "3 news stations have called already. The board wants an emergency meeting this afternoon. Building security needs your signature on their incident report. And Dylan Barrett is waiting in the conference room." Allison paused, checking her watch. "It's only 9:30. I told Morrison 10 o'clock. He arrived at 9, Rebecca said with a slight smile. "Said he didn't want to be late." Allison nodded, setting down her bag. "Give me 10 minutes, then send him to my office. And hold all calls during that meeting." "Already done." "Coffee? Please. And get one for Mr. Barrett, too. Ask him how he takes it." Rebecca raised an eyebrow slightly but simply nodded. Allison headed into her corner office, needing a moment to prepare. She'd spent the previous evening thinking about what to say, how to express gratitude that went beyond standard thank you phrases. But now, knowing Dylan was actually here, she felt unexpectedly nervous. Her office reflected her position and personality. Large windows offered the same views the boardroom commanded. Modern furniture balanced functionality with design. One wall featured awards and recognition she'd received. Another displayed photographs from company milestones, product launches, major contracts signed. Her desk remained surprisingly clear, everything organized and filed systematically. Allison sat in her chair, took a breath, and reminded herself that this was just a conversation. She'd negotiated billion-dollar deals. She'd presented to hostile investors. She could certainly talk to the man who'd saved her life. Rebecca returned with 2 coffee cups. "He takes it black," she reported. "Seemed surprised," I offered. "Thank you, Rebecca." "Send him in." Dylan entered her office moments later, and Allison was struck by how different he appeared in daylight in this context. Still wearing his gray janitor uniform, name embroidered over the pocket, but carrying himself with quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his role. His dark eyes took in the office quickly, assessing without seeming obvious about it. "Military habit," Allison guessed. "Mr. Barrett," Allison stood, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Hughes." His handshake was firm, but not aggressive. "I'm sorry about what happened yesterday." "You're sorry?" Allison gestured to the chairs facing her desk. "Please sit." "You saved my life and you're apologizing?" Dylan settled into the chair, accepting the coffee Rebecca had brought. "I meant sorry you had to experience that. Nobody should have to face that kind of threat." Allison sat across from him, her own coffee cradled in both hands. "No, they shouldn't. But I did, and you stopped it. I wanted to meet with you this morning to say thank you properly, away from all the chaos and witnesses." "It was the right thing to do," Dylan replied simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they couldn't have," Allison countered. "That's the point. Most people would have frozen or run or called for help. You acted immediately, effectively. The police said those men had professional training. You neutralized them in seconds." Dylan was quiet for a moment, his expression carefully neutral. "I had some training myself. Long time ago." "Rangers," Allison said. "James Morrison mentioned it. 12 years of service." Dylan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was a different life, but clearly not a forgotten one. Allison leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Barrett, I'm not trying to invade your privacy. I just want to understand the man who saved my life." "Not much to understand," Dylan said. "I work nights, go home to my daughter, that's pretty much it." "You have a daughter." Allison hadn't known that detail. "How old?" 7, Emma. Dylan's expression softened noticeably when he mentioned his daughter's name. "She's the reason I left the military, the reason I'm here. She's lucky to have a father who prioritizes her." "Unlucky to have her," Dylan corrected. "After my wife died, Emma was the only thing that made sense anymore." The admission surprised Allison with its honesty. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up painful subjects." "It's okay. Happened 5 years ago. You learned to carry it." Dylan took a sip of coffee. "Ms. Hughes, I appreciate the thank you, but I should probably get back to work. My shift ended late last night. I need to pick up Emma from school this afternoon." "Wait," Allison said quickly. "There's more I wanted to discuss. Your position here, your role. Surely you realize that working as a janitor doesn't utilize your actual capabilities." Dylan's expression closed slightly. "It's a good job. Pays my bills. Flexible schedule that works with Emma's school. I understand that, but what if I could offer you something better? Security position, maybe training role. Better pay, benefits, still flexible hours." Allison had prepared this offer carefully. "You'd be an asset in any number of capacities." "I appreciate the offer," Dylan said carefully. "But I like my current position. It suits my needs." "You're refusing a promotion?" Allison couldn't hide her surprise. Better pay, more responsibility, recognition for your skills? I don't need recognition, Dylan replied. And more responsibility means more visibility, more complications. My life works the way it is. I'd like to keep it that way. Allison studied him, trying to understand. You're intentionally staying invisible. I'm intentionally staying focused on what matters. My daughter. Her stability. That requires routine, not excitement. Even after what happened yesterday. Especially after that, Dylan said. I don't want Emma worrying about whether her father is putting himself in danger. I want her to have a normal life, a normal dad. But you're not a normal dad, Allison said gently. You're someone with extraordinary skills who uses them to protect people when necessary. That's admirable. It's a liability, Dylan countered. When you can do certain things, people expect you to do them. Situations find you. I left that behind for a reason. They sat in silence for a moment. Allison realized she was seeing something rare, a person who'd chosen contentment over advancement, who valued peace more than prestige. In her world, where everyone constantly pursued more, Dylan's perspective felt almost foreign. I understand, she finally said. But please know the offer stands. If you change your mind, if circumstances change, there's a place for you here beyond janitorial work. Thank you. Dylan stood, setting down his coffee cup. Is there anything else? Actually, yes. Allison stood as well. I'd like to take you to lunch. As a proper thank you. Nothing formal, just a meal. Dylan hesitated. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. I'd like to do it anyway. Please, let me express my gratitude in some tangible way. I really need to keep a low profile right now. Then somewhere quiet. A place where we won't be noticed. I know a small restaurant in Glendale Heights, actually. Family-owned Italian place. Excellent food, no crowds. Glendale Heights is where I live. I know. I looked up your address in the employee records. I hope that's not too intrusive. Allison offered a slight smile. I wanted to understand who you are. Where you came from. Dylan seemed uncertain, clearly weighing his desire for privacy against politeness. Finally, he nodded. One lunch. But somewhere Emma and I could go together. I don't do things I can't include her in. Of course. Bring Emma if you'd like. Not this time. But knowing I could is important. Dylan moved toward the door, then paused. Ms. Hughes, can I ask you something? Allison. Please call me Allison. Allison. Please call me Allison. Allison, Dylan said, testing the name. Do you ever feel like success costs more than people admit? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? You're CEO of $1 billion company. You've achieved what most people dream about. But yesterday, when those men came in, you were alone. No security detail, no bodyguards. You work late by yourself in an office that's impressive but empty. Doesn't that success feel isolating sometimes? Allison felt suddenly exposed, as if Dylan had seen through carefully constructed walls to something true underneath. Yes, she admitted. It does. More than I like acknowledging. Dylan nodded slowly. That's why I chose different. Not because I couldn't achieve more, but because I'd already learned that lesson. Achievement without connection is just another kind of emptiness. He left before Allison could respond, closing her office door quietly behind him. She stood in her expensive, corner office with its perfect views and prestigious address, and felt the weight of his observation settle over her like morning fog. Rebecca appeared in the doorway minutes later. Everything okay? You look thoughtful. Just processing, Allison said. Rebecca, what do you know about Dylan Barrett? Personal details, I mean. Not much. He's been here 4 years, always reliable, never causes problems. Frank Chun says he's the best employee he's supervised. Keeps to himself mostly. Rebecca paused. After last night, everyone's curious about him. Martin said the way he moved was like something from a movie. It was, Allison confirmed. Like he'd done it 1,000 times before. So what happens now? We schedule that board meeting for this afternoon. We review security protocols. We deal with the media carefully. Allison returned to her desk. And tomorrow, I'm taking Dylan Barrett to lunch, whether he likes it or not. He turned down a promotion? He chose stability over advancement. Apparently, some people actually prefer that. Rebecca smiled knowingly. Sounds like someone who has his priorities straight. Maybe, Allison said. Or maybe he's just afraid of wanting more. Could be both, Rebecca suggested. People are complicated. After Rebecca left, Allison stood at her windows looking at Ashford's skyline. Somewhere in Glendale Heights, Dylan was probably already home, having picked up Emma from school, settling into whatever afternoon routine they maintained. A life built around what mattered rather than what impressed. Allison had spent years proving herself, climbing from nothing to CEO, demonstrating her worth to anyone who doubted her capabilities. She'd won that fight but somehow ended up alone in the victory. Dylan had walked away from capabilities that could have defined him, chosen obscurity over recognition, and seemed more content than she'd felt in years. Maybe saving her life had been more than physical intervention. Maybe he'd also shown her an alternative way of measuring success. Not by titles or wealth or achievement, but by connection, presence, love freely given and received. She had no idea what came next. But for the first time in years, Allison felt curious about possibilities beyond Meridian's growth and her professional reputation. Dylan Barrett had crashed into her carefully ordered world for 15 seconds of violence. The aftermath might last considerably longer. The lunch happened 3 days later at Angelo's, a small Italian restaurant tucked into a strip mall in Glendale Heights. Allison arrived first, deliberately choosing a corner booth away from windows. She dressed casually, jeans and a sweater, avoiding anything that screamed CEO. The goal was conversation, not intimidation. Dylan arrived exactly on time, also in casual clothes. Without his janitor uniform, he looked different. More approachable somehow, though the alertness in his eyes remained constant. He slid into the booth across from her, glancing around the restaurant with that subtle assessment she was learning to recognize. "This place, okay?" Allison asked. "Emma and I come here sometimes," Dylan replied. "Mrs. Russo makes excellent lasagna." As if summoned by mention of her name, an older woman with steel gray hair approached their table. "Dylan, where's your beautiful girl today?" "School, Mrs. Russo. This is Allison, a friend from work." Mrs. Russo's eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply smiled. "Any friend of Dylan's is welcome. I'll bring you both the special." After she left, Allison smiled. "You have fans. Small neighborhood. People know each other." Dylan's expression softened. "Emma spilled an entire plate of spaghetti here last year. Mrs. Russo cleaned it up, made her a new plate, didn't charge us. That kind of thing matters." "It does," Allison agreed. "I've forgotten what that's like, honestly. Being part of a community where people actually notice you. You're one of the most visible people in Ashford. Visible professionally. Invisible personally." Allison traced patterns on the table with her finger. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone would notice if I just disappeared from everything except work." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "Your parents would notice. You researched me?" "Fair's fair. You looked up my address." A hint of humor touched his expression. "Your father still teaches in Detroit. Your mother retired from nursing last year. You call them weekly but haven't visited in 8 months. How do you know that?" "Your assistant mentioned it when she was scheduling board meetings. Said you kept refusing to take vacation days, even though your parents kept asking you to visit." Allison felt exposed again, the way she had in her office. I've been busy. You've been hiding, Dylan said gently. Different kind than mine, but still hiding. Mrs. Russo returned with steaming plates of lasagna before Allison could respond. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the food as excellent as promised. Around them, the lunch crowd filled the small restaurant with conversation and the clink of silverware. Why did you really agree to have lunch with me? Allison finally asked. Dylan set down his fork, considering. Honestly? Because you looked lonely in that office. Successful, powerful, respected. But lonely. I know what that feels like, even with Emma. Especially with Emma sometimes. She's my whole world, which means I've made my world very small. Safe, but small. He paused. You asked in your office if success costs more than people admit. I've been thinking about that. Maybe the cost is only that high if you pay it alone. Are you suggesting we're both paying too much? I'm suggesting maybe we can help each other pay less. Dylan met her eyes directly. I'm not looking for romance or complication. But friendship, someone who understands what it's like to choose certain paths and wonder if they were right. That might be worth the risk of being less invisible. Allison felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. I'd like that, friendship. Ground rules though, Dylan said. Emma comes first always. I don't do spontaneous plans because she needs routine. And I'm still not taking that promotion. Fair enough. My ground rules are, I work too much and probably won't change that immediately. I'm terrible at casual conversation. And I'll absolutely keep offering you that promotion periodically. Dylan's smile reached his eyes this time. Deal. Over the next 3 weeks, an unexpected friendship developed. Allison started taking lunch breaks, something Rebecca claimed was unprecedented. Sometimes Dylan joined her at Angelo's. Other times they'd grab coffee at the shop in Hartwell Tower's lobby. Sitting in the corner where building noise provided privacy, they talked about ordinary things. Emma's school projects and her latest art phase. Allison's frustrations with board politics. The challenge of grocery shopping on a budget versus the luxury of having meals delivered. Dylan's routine of morning runs. Allison's complete lack of exercise despite the gym in her building. You should come running with me, Dylan suggested one afternoon. I'd die after half a mile. So we start with half a mile. Emma rides her bike alongside me sometimes. She'd probably enjoy having company. The invitation surprised Allison. You'd want me around, Emma? She should see that her father has friends. That normal adults have connections outside work and family. Dylan hesitated. Also, she's been asking about the lady from the building. Word reached her school somehow that I helped someone important. She's curious. I'd love to meet her, Allison said honestly. If you're comfortable with that. Saturday morning, 6:30, meet us at Fletcher Park. Dylan stood to leave. Wear actual running shoes, not fashion sneakers. I have running shoes, Allison protested. You have never been used running shoes still in their box. I guarantee it. He was right, but Allison didn't admit it. Instead, she went shopping that evening, buying proper athletic wear for the first time in years. Standing in the sporting goods store, she realized she was excited. Not about the running, which would definitely be terrible, but about being included in Dylan's life, meeting Emma, becoming part of something beyond corporate strategy and quarterly projections. Small steps toward connection. Tiny risks that felt enormous. But for the first time in years, Allison felt like she was moving towards something rather than just running harder on an increasingly lonely treadmill. Saturday, morning running became a regular occurrence. Allison discovered that Dylan had been right about her fitness level, but Emma's cheerful encouragement from her bicycle made the huffing and struggling less embarrassing. The 7-year-old chattered constantly about school, her friends, the butterfly project she was working on for science class. Daddy says you're really smart, Emma told Allison during their third weekend together. He says you run a whole company. I do, Allison confirmed between breaths. Though running this mile is harder than running the company right now. Emma giggled. You'll get better. Daddy says practice makes progress, not perfect. 4 weeks into their friendship, Allison invited Dylan and Emma to a Meridian Company picnic. Dylan had hesitated, but Emma's excitement had won out. The event took place at Riverside Park. Food trucks and games set up for employees and their families. Emma had darted off immediately to the face painting station while Dylan and Allison stood near the beverage table. Several Meridian employees approached to thank Dylan again for the boardroom incident. Their gratitude genuine but making him visibly uncomfortable. You really hate the attention, Allison observed. I prefer being forgettable. Dylan watched Emma, who was now getting a butterfly painted on her cheek. Attention leads to questions. Questions lead to expectations. Or questions lead to connection. Before Dylan could respond, Allison's assistant Rebecca approached quickly, her expression concerned. Allison, we have a situation. Building security just called. There was a break-in at Hartwell Tower last night. Your office specifically. My office? Allison's stomach dropped. What was taken? They're still assessing. Police are there now. They want you to come identify what's missing. Dylan's posture had shifted, that alertness suddenly sharp and focused. Just your office? And the server room apparently, Rebecca said. Very targeted. They knew exactly what they wanted. I need to go, Allison told Dylan. I'm sorry. I know this is supposed to be a relaxing day. I'm coming with you, Dylan said immediately. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. His tone left no room for argument. He called Emma over, kneeling to her level. Sweetheart, something came up at Allison's work. Mrs. Patel is here with her grandson. Can you stay with them while I help Allison? I'll be back in 2 hours. Emma looked between her father and Allison, then nodded seriously. Is it dangerous? No, Dylan assured her. Just important. I'll have my phone if you need anything. At Hartwell Tower, police had cordoned off the executive floor. Detective Sarah Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, met them at the elevator. Ms. Hughes, thank you for coming. We need you to walk through your office and tell us what's missing. Allison's office had been systematically searched. Drawers opened, files disturbed, her computer's hard drive removed. But what chilled her was the photograph on her desk, a picture of her with her parents from 2 years ago. Someone had drawn a red X across her face. This wasn't just corporate espionage, Dylan said quietly, studying the room with professional assessment. This was personal. Detective Chun agreed. The server room breach was sophisticated, but this, she gestured at the marked photograph, suggests someone with a grudge. Any disgruntled employees? Recent terminations? Allison's mind raced through possibilities. We had layoffs 6 months ago in one division. Some people weren't happy. But this level of anger? What about the attackers from last month? Dylan asked. Were they connected to anyone specific? They lawyered up immediately, Detective Chun said. But we're looking into it, Ms. Hughes. I'm recommending you consider personal security until we understand the threat level. After the police finished, Dylan insisted on driving Allison home. In her building's parking garage, he checked her vehicle thoroughly before letting her approach it. I don't like this, he said. The break-in, the marked photo, it feels escalating. I can hire security, Allison said. Though the idea made her feel vulnerable in ways she hated acknowledging. Security helps, but they're reactive. You need to be proactive. Dylan hesitated. Look, I know you value your independence, but until this resolves, maybe don't be alone in isolated places. Vary your routine. Stay aware of your surroundings. You're worried. I'm cautious. There's a difference. His eyes met hers. Yesterday someone wanted to intimidate you. Tomorrow they might want more than that. The fear Allison had been suppressing broke through. This is why I keep people at distance. Getting close means they become targets, leverage. Or it means you have people who'll stand with you when threats emerge, Dylan countered. You're not alone in this, Allison. Whether you like it or not, you have a friend who knows how to handle situations like this. I don't want you in danger because of me. Too late. We're already connected now. Dylan's expression softened slightly. Go upstairs. Lock your doors. I'll check in tomorrow. Allison watched him leave, feeling the weight of vulnerability and gratitude in equal measure. Someone wanted to frighten her, but they'd miscalculated. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Dylan Barrett, and that counted for more than any security service money could buy. The investigation moved slowly. Detective Chen worked multiple leads while Meridian's security team reviewed footage and access logs. Allison hired a professional security service, but Dylan remained her most constant protection, insisting on walking her to her car each evening, checking her apartment periodically, teaching her awareness techniques he'd learned in the Rangers. 3 weeks after the break-in, Dylan received a call at 2 in the morning. Allison's voice, shaky and frightened. Someone's trying to get into my apartment. I can hear them at the door. Security is on the way, but I'm scared. Stay on the phone, Dylan told her, already pulling on clothes. I'm 15 minutes away. He made it in 12, parking illegally and taking stairs 2 at a time. Building security had arrived and apprehended someone in the hallway. Dylan found Allison inside her apartment, arms wrapped around herself, trying to appear calm but visibly shaken. He had a key card, she told Dylan. How did he get a key card to my building? The answer came the next day. The intruder was a former Meridian employee, terminated during those layoffs, who'd been dating someone in building management. He'd stolen the access card and had been planning the harassment campaign for months. The boardroom attack had been unrelated, but he'd seen opportunity in Allison's elevated security concerns. It's over, Detective Chun confirmed. He confessed to everything. The break-in, the photograph, attempting to access your apartment. He's facing multiple felony charges. Allison should have felt relief. Instead, she felt exhausted. That evening, Dylan insisted she come to his apartment for dinner. Emma's been asking about you, he said. And you shouldn't be alone right now. The apartment was small but welcoming, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, photographs of her and Delaney scattered throughout. Emma greeted Allison enthusiastically, showing her the completed butterfly project that had earned an A+ dot over dinner. Simple pasta that Dylan prepared efficiently. Allison felt something inside her begin to unwind. This wasn't her penthouse with its expensive emptiness. This was a home. Lived in, loved in. Real in ways her carefully curated space had never been. After Emma went to bed, Dylan and Allison sat on his small balcony. The Glendale Heights skyline modest but peaceful around them. I've been thinking, Allison said quietly, about what you said at Angelo's. That maybe the cost of success is only that high if you pay it alone. And you were right. I've been so focused on proving myself that I forgot to build anything worth proving myself for. She looked at him. These past weeks, running with you and Emma, having dinners like this, feeling like someone actually cares if I'm okay, it's reminded me what I've been missing. Dylan was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking too. About staying invisible, keeping my world small and safe. Emma's safe, yes. But is she learning that taking risks is wrong? That caring about people outside our tiny circle is dangerous? What are you saying? I'm saying maybe we both needed this. You needed to remember that connection matters more than achievement. I needed to remember that protection isn't the same as living. He turned to face her fully. I care about you, Allison. As a friend, as someone I respect. And that scared me at first because caring means vulnerability. But it also means having something worth protecting beyond just survival. Allison felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. I care about you too. You and Emma both. You've become the best part of my weeks. Then let's stop pretending this is temporary, Dylan said. Let's acknowledge that we're building something here. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up, who stand with you, who make life fuller instead of narrower. I'd like that, Allison whispered. Very much. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other across impossible distances of circumstance and expectation. Both had been hiding in different ways. Both had been wounded by loss and choice. But together, they were discovering that healing happened not in isolation, but in connection. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Daddy, is Allison staying over? Dylan glanced at Allison, who nodded. Just on the couch tonight, sweetheart. Is that okay with you? Emma smiled, seeming to understand something important was happening, even if she couldn't name it. That's good. I like when Allison's here. It feels more like family. After Emma returned to bed, Allison wiped her eyes. She's amazing. You've raised someone truly special. She's teaching me as much as I'm teaching her, Dylan said. Including that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people in. Bravest thing you can do is let people in. That night, Allison slept on Dylan's worn couch, covered by a quilt Emma had helped her pick out. It was the best sleep she'd had in years. Not because the couch was comfortable, but because she wasn't alone anymore. She'd found something she hadn't known she was missing, a place where she belonged simply for being herself. Not for what she'd achieved. 6 months later, Hartwell Tower's lobby had returned to its normal rhythm. Morning coffee rushes, professionals hurrying to elevators, the familiar hum of a building full of purpose. But something had changed in subtle ways that only longtime observers might notice. Dylan Barrett no longer worked the night janitorial shift. Allison had finally convinced him to accept a position in Meridian Security Division, not as a guard, but as a consultant training their teams in threat assessment and crisis response. The pay was substantially better. The hours worked with Emma's school schedule, and most importantly, it utilized his actual skills without forcing him into constant visibility. He still wore practical clothes rather than suits. Still preferred staying behind the scenes. But now he moved through Hartwell Tower with acknowledged purpose rather than invisible routine. People knew his name. More importantly, they knew his story. The janitor who'd saved lives and then quietly returned to living his own. This particular Saturday morning, the building was mostly empty except for a handful of employees catching up on work. Dylan had brought Emma to Meridian's offices where Allison was finishing a presentation for Monday's board meeting. Emma sat at the conference table with her colored pencils and sketchpad, working on her latest artistic project, while occasionally offering commentary on her father and Allison's planning discussion. You should make that slide more colorful, Emma suggested, studying Allison's laptop screen. People pay more attention to pretty things. She's not wrong, Dylan said with a slight smile. Visual engagement matters. Allison adjusted the presentation accordingly, having learned that Emma's observations were often surprisingly insightful. Better? Much better, Emma declared. Now can we go get lunch? I'm starving. They gathered their things and headed to the elevator. As they waited, Emma slipped her hand into Allison's naturally, something that had become routine over the past months. Allison squeezed gently, still marveling at how this small gesture could feel so significant. The elevator arrived and they descended to the lobby. As they crossed toward the exit, Martin at the security desk waved them over. Dylan, got someone here asking about building security positions. Figured you might want to talk to him. A young man in his mid-20s stood near the desk, resume in hand, looking nervous. "I heard this building has excellent security training," he said. "I'm former military, looking to transition to civilian work. Someone told me to ask for Dylan Barrett." Dylan extended his hand. "That's me. Let's talk for a few minutes." While Dylan spoke with the applicant, Emma and Allison waited nearby. A woman entering the building paused, watching them curiously. She approached the security desk where Martin was processing visitor badges. "Excuse me," the woman said, nodding toward Dylan, Allison, and Emma. "Who is that man?" "I'm here interviewing for a position with Meridian, and someone mentioned him during my research. Said he was some kind of hero." Martin followed her gaze, a knowing smile crossing his weathered face. He'd worked this desk for 15 years, seen countless people pass through these doors. But the transformation he'd witnessed in Dylan Barrett and Allison Hughes over the past month stood out as something special. "That's Dylan Barrett," Martin replied. "Used to be our night janitor. Saved our CEO's life when armed men tried to kill her. Turned out he had this whole background nobody knew about. So he's security now." The woman asked. "He's more than that," Martin said, his tone thoughtful. "See that woman with him? That's Allison Hughes, the CEO he saved. And the little girl? That's Dylan's daughter Emma. 6 months ago, they were strangers passing in hallways. Now look at them." The woman observed the trio. Dylan had finished his conversation with the applicant and rejoined Allison and Emma. Emma was showing them both something in her sketchpad, chattering excitedly. Dylan's hand rested naturally on Allison's shoulder. Allison's expression, as she listened to Emma, showed genuine warmth rather than the professional distance she'd once maintained constantly. "They look like a family," the woman observed. "That's exactly what they are," Martin confirmed. "Not by blood, but by choice." Dylan taught Allison that success means nothing without connection. Allison taught Dylan that hiding from life isn't the same as protecting it, and Emma? She taught them both that family is whoever shows up, whoever stays, whoever makes your world bigger instead of smaller. The woman smiled. "That's a beautiful story." "It's a true one," Martin replied. "In this building, we see a lot of people chasing achievement, climbing ladders, measuring worth in titles and salaries. But those three right there, they figured out what actually matters. That's rarer than you'd think." Dylan, Allison, and Emma headed toward the exit, Emma skipping between them, each adult holding one of her hands. As they reached the door, sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating them in golden light. Emma said something that made both adults laugh. Dylan looked at Allison with an expression that spoke of trust earned and freely given. Allison looked back with gratitude for a life saved in more ways than one. The woman watched them leave, then turned back to Martin. "I hope I get this job. If that's the kind of culture Meridian has, where people actually matter, I want to be part of it." "We've gotten better at that lately," Martin said. "Turns out when your CEO almost dies, it reminds everyone what's actually important. Not quarterly projections or market share. People, connection. Building something that means more than profit margins." Outside Hartwell Tower, Dylan, Allison, and Emma walked toward Angelo's for their Saturday lunch tradition. The Ashford skyline rose around them, indifferent and constant. But within that ordinary cityscape, three people had found something extraordinary. Not romance, though that might come eventually. Not rescue, though that had happened too. But family, built deliberately from choice and courage and the willingness to risk being seen. Emma skipped ahead, then turned back to wait for them, her smile bright in afternoon sunshine. Dylan and Allison caught up, and together, the three of them continued forward. Not toward some dramatic conclusion, but toward the simple, profound beauty of another ordinary day spent together. The janitor had saved the CEO, but in the saving, both had discovered they needed rescuing from different kinds of isolation. And in finding each other, they'd built something neither had known they were missing. A home made not of walls but of presence, Not of obligation, but of love freely chosen. That was the real story. Not the 15 seconds of heroic action, but the months of small moments afterward. The quiet revolution of letting people in. The radical act of building family from fragments of broken lives. The discovery that strength wasn't just about protection, but about vulnerability, connection, and the courage to hope for more than mere survival. In the end, Dylan Barrett was just a father. But he was the kind who could protect his whole world, which now included more people than he'd ever imagined allowing in. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.